His team of horses reared at the crack of the stage driver's whip, and Monroe Cutler was already running before he'd finished swearing, because Eli stood not 10 feet from those flailing hooves, small and still as a fence post, watching the chaos with the flat grey eyes that held no light since April. Monroe reached him in 3 strides, hauled him back against his chest, and felt the boy's heart slamming even though his face showed nothing at all. That was the worst of it. 6 years old, and he did not cry out, did not flinch, did not so much as gasp. He only let himself be carried, limp as a sack of meal, while the coach rocked to a stop in a boil of dust. The door opened. A woman climbed down without waiting for the driver's hand, gathering her grey skirt in one fist, and looked first not at Monroe but at the boy in his arms. "Is he hurt?" she asked. "No," Monroe said, and set Eli down, and the boy immediately stepped half behind his father's leg, watching the stranger the way he watched everything now, like a creature deciding whether to run. "I'm glad of that." She came forward anyway, slow the way a person approaches a spooked colt, and crouched right there in the dooryard dust in her traveling clothes, bringing her face level with the boy's. "You gave everyone a fright, standing so close to the horses. I expect you're braver than the rest of us put together." Eli said nothing. He never said anything, but he did not look away from her either, and that alone was more than he'd given the preacher's wife or Monroe's own sister, or anyone who had tried since the fever took his mother. Monroe cleared his throat. "Miss Marsh." "Adeline," she corrected, straightening, and held out a gloved hand as though they were meeting at a church social instead of completing an arrangement made by letter over 4 months and 11 letters, the last of which had simply said, "I will come, if you'll still have me, Mr. Cutler." He took her hand because it would have been rude not to, and found it steadier than his own. "You'll want to see the house," he said, because he did not know what else a man said to the woman he had agreed to marry sight unseen, standing in his own yard with his silent son gripping his trouser leg like a drowning thing gripping a rope. Adeline looked past him at the low cabin with its new second room framed on but not yet sided, at the corrals and the barn and the long, red-gold sweep of grass running off toward the shadow of Elk Ridge, and something in her face eased, as if she had been holding her breath the whole 400 miles and had only now let it go. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's work," Monroe said more sharply than he meant, and regretted it when he saw her flinch. But he'd not take it back, 'cause it was true, and because he had married by mail out of necessity and not romance, and he needed her to understand from the first hour that there would be no poetry in this house. There had been poetry once. He had buried it in April with Sarah. He did not say that part. He only picked up her trunk and carried it inside, and left her standing in the yard with his son, 2 strangers measuring each other in the last long light of the day. Adeline had expected loneliness. She had not expected a child who looked at her as though she were smoke visible, but not quite believed in. She had grown up the youngest of 6 in a house that could not feed a 7th, had taught school in 3 towns and buried her mother in the 4th, and had answered Monroe Cutler's advertisement because a widower needing a wife and a mother for his boy was, at 28 and alone in the world, the closest thing to a future she had been offered in years. She had not lied in her letters. She had not been lied to. Either he'd written plainly that his wife was gone and his son did not speak, that he could offer a roof and honest work and nothing more. She had told herself that was enough, standing now in the yard while Monroe disappeared into the house with her trunk. Watching Eli watch her from 6 feet away with his thumb hooked in his suspender and his jaw set exactly like his father's, she understood that nothing she had been told had prepared her for the particular ache of a child grieving in silence. "Well," she said to him, since no one else was there to hear if she sounded foolish, "I don't know your rules yet. You'll have to teach me. I expect I'll get most things wrong the first month." Eli's eyes moved to her mouth and stayed there, as if words themselves were the strange thing, a foreign object he had lost the trick of catching. She did not press him. She had taught enough children to know that pressing a wound only taught it to hide better. Instead, she picked up her smaller bag and followed Monroe inside, and that first supper passed with the scrape of forks and nothing else. Monroe hunched over his plate like a man serving a sentence, Eli eating 3 bites and pushing the rest around, and Adeline searching for something, anything, to say that would not sound like a schoolteacher's brittle cheer. In the end, she said nothing either. She only reached over when Eli's fork clattered to the floor and picked it up and wiped it on her apron and set it back by his hand without comment, the way she might have done for any child, grieving or not. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked the fork back up and ate. It was not speech, but Monroe, watching from the head of the table, felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not trust. The weeks that followed taught Monroe two things: that Adeline Marsh did not tire easily, and that his son's silence had teeth. She rose before him most mornings, the stove going and the biscuits started, and worked from can't-see to can't-see without complaint, hauling water and mending fence-torn shirts and turning the half-framed second room into something that looked, against all odds, like a home. She was kind to Eli in a way that asked nothing back, braided no expectation into her kindness, the way some folks did, waiting for gratitude like a debt come due. She simply set his plate down, mended his coat, hummed while she worked, and let him decide each day how close he wanted to stand. Most days he stood close. He would not speak, would not laugh, would not so much as nod some mornings, but he trailed her from kitchen to yard to garden the way a shadow trails the sun, and Monroe watched this from the barn, from the fields, from the porch in the blue hour before sleep, and felt something in himself that he refused to call hope, because hope was a thing that had cost him everything once already. He had married Sarah for love, the real foolish, headlong kind, and love had given him 4 good years and a son, and then had taken her from him in 3 days of fever that no doctor within 40 miles turned back. He had stood over her grave with Eli's small hand crushed in his own and understood, with the clarity grief sometimes grants a man, that he would never again let himself want anything that could be taken. He had married Adeline the way a man buys a good mule, for what she could do, not for what she might come to mean. That was the bargain, that was meant to be safe. But there was an evening in the 3rd week when he came in from mending the west fence to find her at the washtub singing, low, almost to herself, some old hymn about a shepherd and 100 sheep, and Eli sitting on the overturned bucket beside her, not looking at her, pretending to whittle a stick with a dull knife he wasn't allowed near the good blades, and listening. Monroe could see it in the boy's shoulders, the stillness of a creature caught between fear and wanting. He stood in the doorway a long while and did not go in, because he did not want either of them to know he'd seen, and because something in his throat had gone tight and unfamiliar, and he was not ready to name it either. That night after Eli was abed, Monroe found Adeline on the porch step, her sewing basket in her lap, motes circling the lamp glass. "You sing," he said. It was not a question, and it came out clumsier than he meant. "My mother did." Over every kind of work, washing, sickness, burying. She did not look up from her needle. It fills the quiet. I've found the quiet is often the hardest part, for people who are hurting. It isn't restful, it's just loud in a different way. Monroe sat, not beside her exactly, but near on the step below. He hasn't spoken since the funeral. 3.5 months. The doctor in Larkspur says there's nothing wrong with his throat. Says it'll come back when it comes back and there's no forcing it. He turned his hat in his hands. I don't know how to reach him. I'm his father and I don't know how. You don't reach a child like Eli by asking him to come to you, Adeline said. You reach him by staying close enough, long enough, that eventually he isn't afraid to. That easy. I didn't say easy, I said simple. Those aren't the same thing. She glanced at him then, and in the lamp's small light he saw she was not a woman who pitied him, which he found unexpectedly a relief. You lost her too, Mr. Cutler. I don't imagine you've done much singing yourself. He had no answer for that. He sat with her a while longer in the moth light and the cricket song, and when he finally rose to go in, he found himself saying, "Monroe," like a door left in a crack. "Monroe," she said back, testing it, and something in him settled that had not settled in a very long time. Spring wore on towards summer, and the ranch, and the 3 of them in it, began, slowly the way a bruise fades rather than the way a lamp is lit, to soften. Adeline found Sarah's old sewing basket in the trunk under the window, still threaded with a needle mid-stitch on a quilt square that had never been finished, and instead of putting it away out of sight as she might have, out of some misplaced sense of not wanting to be a ghost's rival, she set it on the shelf where Eli could see it. And one grey afternoon she sat down and finished the square herself, in Sarah's own faded thread, matching the pattern as best she could. She did not tell Eli what she was doing, She simply did it, humming, while rain ticked against the window glass. He came and stood beside her chair. Watched her hands. After a long while he reached into the basket himself and drew out a scrap of blue calico and held it up to her without a word, the way another child might have asked a question aloud. "This piece, here?" "Yes," Adeline said, careful to keep her voice as ordinary as breathing, though her heart was going hard. "Just there. You've a fine eye." He sat down on the floor by her feet and stayed the whole afternoon, handing her scraps, and though he never once spoke, something had cracked open that had been sealed since April, and both of them, in their separate silent ways, understood it. It was Adeline, too, who began singing to him at night, not asking, just sitting on the edge of his small bed with the door open to the kitchen light and singing the shepherd hymn low until his eyes closed, and Monroe took to standing in the hall those nights, unseen, listening the way a starving man listens outside a kitchen window, and he stopped pretending to himself that what he felt for her was only gratitude. He kissed her the evening of the barn raising, when half of Elk Ridge had come to help him finish the second room's roof, and home again full of Adeline's pie, and the two of them stood alone in the last light stacking dishes, and he simply turned her by the shoulder and pressed his mouth to hers, brief and unpracticed and entirely certain. And when he drew back, she was smiling in a way he had not seen on her before, unguarded all the way through. "I wasn't going to do that until I was sure," he said. "And are you sure?" "I am now." He touched her jaw with a thumb rough as fence wire, gentle as anything. "I didn't think I had room left in me for it. Turns out I did. Turns out you just had to sing loud enough to find it." She laughed, and it was the first time he'd heard that sound in his own kitchen since Sarah, and instead of grief it brought only warmth, because it was not the same sound. It was a new one, hers, and he had decided, standing in that gold and dust-moted light, that he was glad to have two songs to remember instead of mourning the one. The storm came up out of the northwest on a night in late June, fast the way high country storms are fast. No warning but a greening of the sky and then the whole world cracking open. Adeline woke to Monroe's hand on her shoulder and his voice low and urgent. "Eli's not in his bed." She was up and pulling a shawl over her nightdress before the sentence finished landing, her heart already hammering. They searched the house first, foolish hope, under the bed, behind the trunk, and found nothing. And then Monroe was out the door into rain that came sideways, lightning turning the yard white and black by turns, shouting his son's name into wind that tore the sound away before it traveled 10 feet. Adeline grabbed the lantern, though it guttered and near died twice before she got the glass shut against the wet, and ran for the barn, because it was the place Ely went most, the place with Sarah's old mare still stabled, gentle and grey and nearing 30. The one living thing besides his father that had known his mother. She was right. She heard him before she saw him. Not words, never words, but a thin, high, keening sound from the loft ladder, and her lantern light found him halfway up. One bare foot slipped through a broken rung. The wood cracked and canted beneath him, the drop below him not far, but far enough, onto packed earth and a scattering of old harness hooks, and the old mare below him screaming and rearing in her stall at the thunder, close enough that a wrong fall would put him under those hooves. "Ellie," Adeline's voice cracked on his name. "Eli, don't move, sweetheart, don't move an inch." He didn't move. He couldn't, his whole small body had locked rigid with terror, his fingers white on the ladder rail, and behind her the barn door slammed open and Monroe was there, soaked through. And for one terrible second father and mare and boy were all three of them screaming or straining in the storm light, and nothing in the world seemed like it would hold. "I've got you," Monroe said, low, steady, forcing calm into his voice that he did not feel, already moving toward the ladder. "I've got you, son, hold on." But the mare reared again, closer, spooked past reason by a crack of thunder that shook dust from the rafters, and Monroe had to check himself, had to choose in that half-second between his son and the animal that could kill him reaching for him. And in that terrible hanging moment it was Adeline who did the only thing she knew. She began to sing, not loud, not calm, not at first, her voice shaking as badly as her hands. But she sang the shepherd hymn, the one she'd sung over his bed 40 nights running. And she walked straight toward the old mare's stall singing it, low and true, the way her mother had sung over sick beds and worse. And the mare's ears came round toward the sound, and her scream gentle to a blowing snort, and her hooves came down and stayed down. "Go," Adeline said to Monroe, not stopping the song, keeping it going soft, and even while he went up the ladder 2 rungs at a time and got both arms around his son and pulled him free of the broken rung, the wood giving way and clattering down into the empty stall a heartbeat after Eli's foot came loose. Monroe carried him down and the boy clung to his neck with both arms, shaking, and Adeline finished her verse and came to them both, laying a hand on Eli's wet hair, and it was there. In the lantern light, with the storm still battering the roof and the mare quieted to soft blowing breaths behind them, that Eli Cutler opened his mouth against his father's shoulder and said the first word he had spoken since his mother died. "Papa," small, barely a word at all. And then, louder, sobbing it now, both arms locking tighter. "Papa, I heard her, I heard Mama's horse, and I thought if I could just—" He could not finish it. He'd not need to. Monroe sank down onto an overturned feed bucket with his son in his lap and simply held him, rocking, saying his name over and over like it was the answer to a prayer he had stopped believing would be answered, and Adeline knelt beside them both in the wet straw with her hand on Eli's back, singing so quietly now it was almost only breath, until the boy's sobs wore down into hiccups and then into the loose, worn stillness of a child finally letting himself be found. They stayed that way long after the mare had settled and the worst of the storm had walked on east, the 3 of them in a heap on the barn floor, Monroe's coat around all of them, and when Eli finally spoke again it was to Adeline, muffled against his father's shirt, 4 words that undid her more thoroughly than any storm could. "Will you sing tomorrow too? Every day," she told him, and meant it with a whole heart. "For as long as you'll let me." Morning came clean and rinsed, the sky the pale scoured blue that follows a hard storm, and Adeline stood at the stove with Eli's chatter, thin and halting still, a boy relearning a language he'd half forgotten, but chatter all the same, filling the kitchen for the first time since she'd arrived. He asked her the names of things. He asked if the mare was truly his mother's. He asked, shyly, if Adeline might teach him the shepherd's song proper, all the words, so he could sing it himself sometime. Monroe stood in the doorway and watched them both, his son and his wife, and thought of the man he had the day the stage pulled in, certain he had nothing left to offer beyond a roof and a wage. He had been wrong about that, the way a man is sometimes glad to be wrong. He crossed the kitchen, kissed Adeline's temple in front of God and his son and the wood stove, and said for the first time without the old caution weighing down the words, "I love you." Simple as that, true as anything he'd ever said. "I know," Adeline said, smiling against the rim of her coffee cup. "You've been singing it for weeks. You just didn't have the words yet either." Outside, the ranch lay green and steaming in the new sun, the mountains standing patient over Elk Ridge the way they had stood over every grief and every mending this land had ever held. And inside the little house a boy hummed off-key over his breakfast, unafraid now to be heard. And a man who had thought his heart done with wanting anything found that it had room enough, after all, for a whole and singing life.